talking about cybersecurity budgeting. So now it's not going to be the same boring conversation that we have every year, right? So to give you some context, this is going to be coming from a unique perspective, and I'm going to get into my background for those of you that don't know me, and I want to kind of give you that, perspective. Um, where I'm coming from on this. So tell you a little bit about me. I'm the VP of Offensive Security here at Security 360. I like to refer to myself as a hacker wrangler. We have a team of penetration testers, and that is my primary role, is creating support mechanisms and making sure that they have the tools to succeed. So you're probably already thinking like, well, what does this guy know about budgeting? Well, I've been doing cybersecurity stuff. Well, actually, the slide's old. It's well over 20 years now, right? Showing my age. And so I started out in banking, and I spent, nearly 2 decades doing cybersecurity in banking context. Application penetration testing was really my primary focus, but I was heavily involved in a lot of these different elements associated with budgeting. And so, when we were going through budget season in the financial world, it was always a scramble. We never planned it well. We were fortunate to have a large budget, so it wasn't a big deal. But I can understand the struggles, and I have been through this process more times than I care to count. So, also got a big background in OWASP. If you guys aren't familiar with OWASP, they're a nonprofit web application security organization. Highly suggest you check them out. Everything they do is free and open source for the community to use. So I'm a big fan of their mission in just trying to make the world a safer place for applications. So yeah. All right. Non-relevant stuff. Yeah, I do a bunch of law enforcement, military training stuff, electronic warfare. It's really the same thing, right? It's the same as the computer side as it is, on the military law enforcement side. So there's a lot of overlap there, and that's the reason that I play in both of those spaces. Okay, so why does it matter what my background is compared to what we're going to be talking about today, right? So my perspective is going to be kind of centered around pen testing, right? And of course, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, of course it is. Yeah, but hear me out before you judge it, right? So when we are looking at budgeting, I want to cover a couple of fundamental basic things first, things that everyone should be doing. And I want you to look at every one of these slides as we progress through this conversation, thinking outside the box, right? We don't have to budget the same way we do it every single year. There are better ways to do things. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at some alternative angles that we can approach budgeting from. So the first thing that I want you to do is look back over the last 2 years. Figure out what was working for you and what was not working for you. So we're going to talk about some pitfalls later, but one of the most important things I want you to take away from this conversation is we don't have to keep doing something just because we've always done it, right? You should be asking yourself, do I really need to renew that tool? Is there something better out there? Are we even using it, right? What about consulting spend? Do you really need to hire that guy who comes in every year to do your internal audit or whatever that is? Maybe you don't, right? So where can we shave a little bit, and where can we reallocate or double down on things that are really working well for us? So those are some big questions I want you to ask yourself. The consulting spend, let's analyze that over the last 2 years. And I say 2 years because I think we traditionally think of budgeting in that annual cycle, right? That fiscal year. The problem is, I would ask you this question: how many of your cybersecurity projects only last 12 months? Well, probably none, right? And so that's a really odd kind of, box to put everything into. And so we need to be thinking about this in the context of the life cycle of these cybersecurity initiatives. Whether that be, hey, we need to upgrade our firewall. Maybe that's, hey, we need a WAF. There are any number of things that can take that form. But I want you to stop thinking about, what am I going to do for the next 12 months? I want you to think about, what did I do for the last two cycles of 12 months, last 24 months? What worked, what didn't, what can we get rid of, right? So it's not always just adding to it. We might want to take some of that back, right? And decide that this isn't working for us. And then also think about more than just the purchasing and the consulting. And we're going to get into that. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The other thing, what major shifts have occurred in threat actor TTPs? And if you don't know what a TTP is, it's, techniques, tactics, procedures associated with the bad guys. They have processes too. They have standard tooling. They have all of these things in place. They're operating just as professionally as you are in your work environment, and we have to understand how that is. And so, what I would say is, what major attacks took place over the last 18 to 24 months? Let me overlay that on my tech stack and let me identify where I might have gaps, right? And we're going to talk about specific ways to do that. But the first thing I want you to see here is this identity related attacks over the last 18 months, right? And so the one thing that I want you to take away from this is the identity aspect of this. So the cybersecurity landscape has been evolving towards this. I think a couple of years ago we called it zero trust. Well, it's not even that anymore. It's just how we do business, right? Everything is pushing to the cloud. We're SSOing everything through Microsoft or whoever it is. And so, we're pushing all of this out to these third parties, all this stuff out to the cloud. And the only way we can protect those resources is using identity providers like Microsoft, using identity providers to validate the end user and then authenticate them to that product. So you don't have to VPN into the network. It's all on the public web anyway. We just have to authenticate to it. So what we've done effectively is we've taken the, internal network, opened it completely up. There's no perimeter anymore, right? The perimeter now is the identity itself. And the attackers have figured this stuff out, right? Obviously, we're always playing catch up with these guys, and so unfortunately, there are some really big players in the IT space and big players just in general who have found this out the hard way. And that's kind of what we see here with these different attacks that we're seeing, where people are stealing tokens, people are compromising identities, and so the identity itself has basically become the thing that we're worried the most about. And it's not just credentials, folks. We're going to get into the details of that, but the point that I want you to take away from this is, if massive entities like AT&T and T and Microsoft are getting their lunch handed to them, then we need to be paying attention, right? So that's kind of the big takeaway that I want you to have from this is, again, just a quick recap, and we're going to recap again at the end. What was good? What was bad in the last 2 years? What can we do better? Let's analyze our spending to make sure that we're not throwing money away for literally no reason. Just because we did last year doesn't mean we have to this year. And then we need to go ahead and get our head around what the attackers are doing, what the bad guys are doing. And so, our old school thought of, patching. Of course, I want you to patch. Is that the most important thing in the world? Maybe, maybe not, depending on your architecture. But we just need to be thinking and continuously evolving on that. Okay. Here are some interesting takes on budgeting, and I'm going to credit Jim Richardson over here at Security 360. He's been doing the CTO CFO thing forever, and so I asked him, like, what are some weird things that you do that might make people go, really, when we're talking about budgeting, right? And so the first thing that we need to understand is that flexibility is absolutely going to be integral. And so if you go to your CFO, you take this cybersecurity, budget package to them, and you're like, I'm going to spend exactly this amount of money. Here are the things I'm going to do. We are not taking into account the things that we don't yet know. So there's kind of two ways that we can approach this. Way number one is looking at this quarter by quarter, right? And then having some flex built into the budget. That is absolutely going to be critical. If you get 10 months into this budgetary season and then suddenly, hey, there's this new threat on the horizon, we need to test for it. We think we have it covered. We have no idea what kind of monitoring we have related to this new threat. What are we going to do about it? Well, I mean, that's easily 50, 60K, right? Or depending on how you want to go about that, it could be less. But the point being is that there will always be flex. Again, if we look back and we're honest with ourselves about what we saw, 18, 24 months before, there were probably a lot of things that hit us we weren't ready for. So If we know those things are going to occur, in all likelihood, we need to be looking forward for that. So make sure you have some flexibility in that. Also, with regards to quarter by quarter, look at your initiatives. Look at what you already have from a project perspective, from a planning perspective, and then we're going to analyze where we think we're going to be in that quarter versus this quarter, and that's going to get us, kind of that, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. So we're gonna break this thing up into bites so that we kind of have some understanding of spend. And what I would encourage you to do as well is look at the life cycle of these projects that you have. They are not going to be uniform in cost, right? Their cost is going to be changing as we move through this life cycle, whether that be effort, whether that be, licensing infrastructure, whatever it might be. And so with this test, discover, remediate, address cycle, this is what I mean when I start talking about looking at this quarter by quarter, right? So we're going to talk more about this, but if I want to do a pen test next year on a web app that I'm working on, or let's say I'm planning on acquiring a new piece of software, I need to have those cycles built in. We're going to validate that. What are we going to validate it against? We're going to do that research. How are we going to validate it? And then we're going to break that up into this test, discover, remediate, address cycle, and we're going to build it out by quarter. That allows us to have some flexibility with regards to what we're doing. So when I talk about considering objectives, let me give you an example, right? Most folks are, have internal audit. Most folks might have some regulatory stuff. Pretty much everybody's doing pen testing for the most part at this stage of the game. But the vast majority of folks that we work with when they do a pen test is we're at the end of the budget cycle or we're planning for next year, and we're solely looking at the time it's going to take to perform the pen test itself, right? So we spend the money, we get on a kickoff call, we have a conversation about it, we schedule it, we do it, we deliver a report. Let me ask you this, is that ever all there is to it? Absolutely not, right? And so what I would say is, first of all, a pen test is a test you should study for, right? And so are we examining our internal processes for things like asset inventory? Are we managing patches? What about configuration options? What about just knowing what our application portfolio looks like? And so that process takes time leading up to the pen test itself. Then we execute the pen test. There's going to be resources associated with that are going to have costs. But then the real work begins. Now we're start talking about remediation. Now, here's what I would say is I would say we're going to start having this conversation and doing this pen test leading to the next budget season, right? Why would we do it in that way? Well, it's going to tell us what we're doing wrong. And so I'm going to have more detail on this for you in a few slides, but think about these really important events that occur on an annual basis. Are we planning for and budgeting for them appropriately? So the downstream effects of these audits, these pen tests, whatever these things are, these benchmarks, that's the real work. That's where the budget comes in. And that's where the flex may come into as well, right? So we have this web app, we do a pen test on it, we discover all these vulnerabilities, we realize those vulnerabilities are going to take a lot longer than we expect, to remediate. So we need to go buy WAF, right, as a short-term virtual patching type situation. So that's what I would encourage you to do, right? Alongside your projects, alongside your regular spend, let's start creating this life cycle and time these things throughout the year. Don't schedule your pen test in the middle of your busy season, right? We have this conversation with folks all the time is, we'll do the pen test, we'll take the remediation efforts to them. And they're like, well, we're in the middle of a release or, it's so-and-so season. And so this is going to have to get pushed out. Dude, you knew when that season was before you even bought this pen test. So we need to plan better so that those resources can be allocated appropriately to remediate these issues and then address the downstream problems themselves. So that's what I would encourage you to do. All right, what are we budgeting for? So this slide is really more for those of you that haven't lived through infinite budget cycles like some of us have. And so I want to look at what we call blocking and tackling. We're just talking about the basics. And then I'm going to talk about some mistakes that I see a lot of people make with regard to acquisition and purchasing of certain types of technology. So the first thing, singular, most important thing you can ever do as part of your cybersecurity program is asset management. If you don't know you have it, you cannot secure it. You cannot patch it. You cannot track it as part of your normal process. And so if you don't have an asset management program, and by program, I mean policy, process, technology, if you don't have that and you can't look at me and say, dude, it is awesome, then you are way behind, right? So let's just start there. If you don't have that, you're already messed up. So, hey, maybe we need a budget for that, right? Um, a direct follow on from that is basic fundamental vulnerability management programs. Again, we have to master the basics. If you guys have ever gone to like an advanced school of training in any discipline, right? I'm thinking in my head like specifically like military law enforcement, but like in any discipline at all, these instructors are going to tell you master the fundamentals. That is how you win. That's what I'm trying to talk about right here. Okay. So our vulnerability management program. How are you doing that, right? If your vulnerability management program is do a Nessus scan and then push that over to the patch team and have them do patches, you are so far behind the curve right now. So vulnerability management takes multiple forms, but first and foremost, I want to tell you that you should have two of them. Why do I need two vulnerability management programs, Brad? Well, because a patch and a vulnerability are not equal to another patch and another vulnerability, right? If this, 7.5, which is a high risk on a CVSS 3.1 scale, is not being exploited in the wild, if there are no proof of concepts out there on GitHub, what are we worried about, right? I get that it's a high. I'm absolutely on board with patching this stuff. But what about that medium risk vulnerability over there, that 6.1 that has an active exploit in the wild and can be chained with other exploits to create, an RCE condition or some crazy thing? Um, I would say that has a priority over a higher CVSS score. So the first thing that I want to say out of the gate, you should have a high risk patching process, which is this vulnerability is actively being exploited in the wild. We can point to multiple threat actors that are using it. There's proof of concepts everywhere. It's at DEF CON. They're doing talks on this thing. We got to address this, and it's going to be the highest priority. So that is a high priority patch process. Secondary to that will be your normal SLA, which is like, oh, a high has to get patched in 2 weeks and a medium in 30 days or whatever that looks like. That's fine. You need that too, right? But the reality is, if you're just chasing the patch numbers and the vulnerabilities, you're going to stay behind, and that's okay. But that's why we have a secondary vulnerability management program that is specifically designed to address high risk threats. So here's the other thing I want to talk to you guys about. And this is something I see absolutely everywhere. Nessus is an amazing tool. OpenVAS, amazing tool. Netrix, I think that there are lots of vulnerability scanners out there. Okay. The vast majority of them stop at the port. What does that mean? Well, if I have a website, okay, and Nessus scans my website as part of a normal network basic scan, right? It is not looking for things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, user enumeration. These are more advanced, more specific types of vulnerabilities that a basic network vulnerability scanner is not going to find. And so what we see a lot is someone will come to us, we'll go into a penetration test engagement, and they say, man, we got a killer vulnerability management program. We're absolutely crushing it. And then, by noon on the first day, I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but I just enumerated all of your customers off of your website. Well, what do you mean? Well, dude, you're not doing web scanning. we web apps are actually a real thing, right? We have to treat them a little bit differently than we treat everything else. Same thing with cloud, man. Same thing with any other number of things that we push past the port itself. Nessus and all of the, other things like Nessus are hyper focused on, oh, you're running an old version of Apache. Here are all the CVEs associated with that. Don't get me wrong, there's value, but we have to look beyond that, right? The threats, and Spencer and I did a podcast on this a little while back. The number of like RCE remote code exploit, like running a C# file against a port on your server facing the public. It's not happening like that anymore, folks. We're breaking in through web flaws, cloud flaws, and identity flaws. And here's the best part. None of your vulnerability scanners are looking at that stuff. So do we really have a good vulnerability management program now? I would say no. And so I would encourage you, if you're not already employing some sort of web vulnerability, assessment, you should be, right? And there are lots of tools out there that can do that. I don't care which one you use, as long as you're using one, right? Doesn't have to be right all the time. It just has to be consistently wrong, if that makes sense. But the point being, we are ignoring this element of our vulnerability management, attack surface, and we really shouldn't be. So I'd encourage you guys to plug that gap. If that's not something you have, guess what? It's budgeting season. Let's go get it. If you don't have a handle on the basics of what I would call identity protection, okay, things like multi-factor authentication, right? And I want to be really clear here. Tested and validated multi-factor authentication, because we see this stuff all the time where we're on a pen test, we're doing, password spraying, credential stuffing, whatever it is, and then we log in with a user who, by the way, hasn't registered with MFA yet. So we get prompted to register, and we're like, oh yeah, dude, grab my phone, scan the QR code. Now I'm Sally Jones. And so, yeah, you had MFA turned on. Yeah, you had it enforced, but you know what you didn't have? You didn't have any sort of validation for new users when they registered. So that means all I have to do is get the timing right. So there are wrong ways to do MFA, and there are I guess less right ways. Let's call it that, right? So what do we need to be doing, right? Well, we need to be enforcing it and validating that enforcement, and then we need to be testing it, right? I mean, we do that as part of a pen test. There are lots of other ways that you can go about doing that. But if you're, going on and flipping on MFA in M365, and then you go about your business, you're not as squared away as you might think you are. So again, blocking and tackling, these are the basic fundamental things that if you're not doing, they need to be in your budget for next year. Let's talk about conditional access. Conditional access is absolutely fundamental in protecting your identities, especially if you're SSOing everything through M365. You're putting a lot of weight on the successful defense mechanisms that exist within M365. And there are some good ones, but you need to be using them and taking advantage of them. So if you don't have conditional access, or worse yet, you don't know, yeah, that's going to be a 26 budget item. We got to figure that out, right? Same thing with password managers. I am amazed at the number of organizations that do not purchase and distribute and deliver password managers to their employees. If you are not doing that, you are wrong. And I'll tell you why. Human beings are absolutely horrific at creating passwords, right? If we will, when you create that like standard password complexity thing, the vast majority of your users are going to create the minimum length, least complex iteration of your rule set as they possibly can. They are not creating passwords out of the need for security. They are creating those passwords to be as simple as they can be, so that when they type them in on their phone, it's not a problem, right? We do not need to be hand typing passwords in 2026, folks. We absolutely do not need to be doing that. So deliver those password managers to your endpoints, put them on their phones. I don't even know what my passwords are, right? Like 99% of the passwords that I use are like 24 randomly generated characters that I just copy and paste out of my password manager. And that's how it should be, right? Because we as threat actors, and again, I actually know that side of it, when we're attacking passwords, if that's what you're using, we're not going to have a lot of success with that. So question, Victor, what about risk-based conditional access over standard conditional access policies? Absolutely yes. So we start getting into the risk-based, meaning, is there a reputation on this IP? Is it coming from, some place that I don't love? Absolutely, yes. I want you to turn on that stuff. And so we start out low, right? Basic standard conditional access, and then we start elevating those until, and I would keep pushing those to be more and more restrictive until we hit a barrier. And that barrier might be, oh, well, now we just created a problem for some users that are on the fringe. Now we are at a place where we can start really deep diving into the individual policies and stuff like that. Um, Yeah, okay. So another awesome question. Phishing resistant MFA hardware keys, they're expensive. That's a really good point. And I'm gonna talk about that in a few minutes, but I'll kind of address your question so I don't forget. Um, Phishing resistant MFA is not hard to do, right? What we mean by that is not all MFA is created equal. And so, for example, Duo Push, love Duo Push. Not for the reason you think, because it makes it easy for us to get into your environment, because we can do push fatigue, prompt bombing, whatever you want to call it. Microsoft has number matching, which is absolutely phishing resistant. And that is at no additional cost to what you're already paying for in your M365 environment. So hardware keys, I agree they are expensive. I would say I would scope that to high risk accounts, right? Executives, if they'll tolerate it. And then, IT admins, people that are in important positions that are likely to be targets of spear phishing. That's where I want to put that spend for hardware keys. But honestly, man, if you guys are implementing really good conditional based access control, if you're implementing number matching MFA, strong and complex passwords that are being saved and stored in a key vault, I'm not that worried about hardware tokens at that point, right? Now, there are some other vulnerabilities, and we're going to actually talk about those in this slide today along that same vein. But those are really good questions, folks. Keep those questions coming. Um, Absolutely excellent. And if I didn't get something addressed as part of your question, you know, ask for more clarity. We'll absolutely talk about it. So yeah, password managers are just as important, in my opinion, as MFA. They're equally important because otherwise your users are going to be putting garbage passwords out there. Um, Detection and monitoring. I'm going to talk a little bit about that again in some other slides. Here's the takeaway at a kind of bottom line up front perspective, right? You're not going to stop everything. You know, ask Spencer who does internal pen testing. He's here in the webinar. Like, how many times do you bypass um, EDR? All the time, right? And so we are going to do the best we can for blocking and preventing and stopping attackers, but it is inevitable on a long enough timeline the bad guys are going to get in. And this is why we are now putting a lot of our focus on detection monitoring, right? So we're basically at the point like, okay, I assume the guy's going to get in at some point, right? And so when they do, what happens? I like to say, how big is the crater? And Spencer would probably be more specific about, well, what telemetry do we have? Like, kind of visibility do we have? What about alerting, logging, things like that? All of that is critically important because once they do get in, now our goal, since we're past prevention at this point, right? Now our goal is to create enough barriers for them to trip over that we can catch them as early in that process as possible so that we can jettison them from our environment, contain the threat, and repair what's been done. So that's where our budget needs to be looking these days, right? And I'm not telling you to go turn your EDR off, right? I'm just saying your EDR is an important part of it. And I even have that in the pitfalls, right? So we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit. Um, but we've moved past this prevention thing. And so the takeaway here, look at this, 194 days average dwell time for compromises or major breaches that happened since 2003. 194 days, right? Again, we are way past prevention at this point. Why is it taking us 200 days to figure out there's a threat actor in our environment? Well, I'll tell you, it's because we have not given detection and monitoring the attention that it needs. And that is why, for example, I keep going back to Spencer because he's kind of spearheading a lot of this effort, that we have these grids and these timeline breakdowns in our pen test reports to say, hey, you logged this, you didn't alert, you didn't block. And so we're actually analyzing your detection and monitoring capability as part of a standard internal assumed breach penetration test because it is that important, right? If it was not that important, then I would just be like, yeah, pass fail, right? It's not that simple anymore. So we really have to get down to the fundamentals of how well we are executing on detecting and how well we're monitoring. The other thing I'll tell you is tool sprawl, right? This is kind of a buzzword. I don't love that. I just don't have a better word for it. Um, having worked in very large environments with big budgets, we were notoriously bad at just buying stuff off the shelf dropping it in the environment and saying, yay, we have whatever it is, right? Um, and then we just leave it there, and it kind of rots on the vine. And then, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Everything in your cybersecurity tech stack requires care and feeding. We do not need to buy a new tool if the other 11 tools that we bought are not being utilized to their maximum capacity. You are better served getting consulting hours from the vendors of those tools to maximize the value that you're getting out of those, right? We did a pen test not too long ago, and we went up against Darktrace. Okay, and my opinion of Darktrace is not super positive, generally speaking. And it's not even Darktrace's fault, right? It's because it requires a ton of care and feeding. Well, this particular firm that we did the pen test for had put in the time, the care and the feeding required to get this tool to a very, very high level of efficiency and operation. And it was awesome. And they absolutely did a great job on that pen test. But that was the difference between, whoever we pen tested before that, who had a lot of similar tools that were not optimized, that had not been maximized, and we step all over them, right? And that a really good example of that would be EDR. We see this all over the place, man, where somebody buys EDR, put it on the desktop, hands off, right? EDR is working. We got EDR. We check that box. We move on to the next hot thing. Absolutely not. There's some Darktrace fans in the chat, so that's cool. But yeah, so why can we not do that? Well, EDR is cool. Don't get me wrong, does a great job natively, but we have to tune this thing. We have to test it, right? And so we see these on, literally every week we're going up against a different EDR, different way of implementing it. And so, again, care and feeding, folks. If you have not maximized it, you're wrong. Yeah, there you go. Spencer says tune, test, torture, repeat. It's a little more savage than I would go, but I like it, right? So yeah, absolutely. We want to test these things, and that's another aspect of this actually that I'm going to talk about is kind of validation. We absolutely need that. So in summary, get your fundamentals squared away before you go doing some, before you go to the moon, right? And then also prevention is not where it's at right now. Detection and monitoring is where it's at, and maximize what you have. Okay, what about the new stuff? So we kind of covered the fundamentals. What's new? What do I need to be worried about? And that's I'm assuming most of you came here for this conversation, which is like, all right, cool. I know how to budget. I got my fundamentals squared away. What am I not thinking of going into 2026 that's going to be a gap for me? And that's where we're going to talk about this right now. So first of all, I'm going to go clockwise, but I'm going to start with cloud misconfigurations. Something like 30 to 40%. I can't remember the exact stats. I read them when I was half asleep, but like 30, 40% of the major large scale breaches that have occurred in the last 18 months involve cloud misconfiguration. We are in such a rush, and it's not even really our fault, right? The vendors are pushing us there, but we are in such a rush to push all of this stuff out into the SaaS environments, into the cloud. And I mean, I can literally hear the same phrase from our clients as they come to us and they're like, hey man, I'm all up in the cloud. I have no idea what I'm doing, right? We got to fix that, right? So that's the number one thing I want you to think about going in, and these are kind of in order, but I think I have them rated later or something like that. But if you don't know what you're doing in the cloud and you do not have expertise on your staff to make sure your cloud is squared away, you need to find somebody who does. This is a really good example of a good opportunity for consulting spend that you might have been wasting on some other dumb stuff that you can apply towards securing your cloud environment and making sure that it's squared away. And I just want to be really clear here. The defaults are not okay. Okay. If you spun up your M365 environment during COVID and it hasn't changed because you were pushed out there and now it's part of business, you need to look at that stuff. There are really good resources out there CIS benchmarks, Microsoft lockdown guides, tons of resources on how to do that. You don't even need to hire somebody if you're comfortable going out and doing the research and doing this yourself. So if that's something you want, like you want to say, hey, Brad, what CIS benchmark are you using? Or what Microsoft document are you talking about? My contact info is at the end of this thing. Send me an email. We'll have a conversation about it. But you need to be paying attention to your cloud presence. Identity abuse. I've already hit on this a couple of times. I'm going to keep beating this drum, folks. Identity is where it's at. And if you do not have protection mechanisms in place, or you do not have visibility into the telemetry associated with your identities, you are going to set yourself up for failure. We'll talk more about that. Fileless attacks. I think I saw something like 70% of current breaches used fileless attacks, like 18 months, right? Same kind of window we're talking about. What are fileless attacks? Well, they're running in RAM, right? And so that becomes a very difficult place for a lot of these EDR products to detect. So what are you going to do about it? You're going to pick up the phone. You're going to call your sales rep for your EDR company or whoever's responsible for that. You're going to say, hey, tell me what you guys are doing about fileless attacks. Talk to me about what kind of protections I have in place, right? Or get a red team to test it for you. But the reality is, if you don't know the answer to this question, am I protected? What level of protection do I have? What are the threat actors doing? And how does that overlay onto my tech stack? You're missing out. Okay. SaaS exploitation, this is kind of in the same bucket of cloud misconfigs. The reason that I have this differentiated for you is, with cloud misconfigs, that's your cloud, right? That's your tenant. You own that. You control that. A lot of these SaaS platforms you don't, right? But you're still SSOing into this SaaS platform. And so you need to understand what kind of security mechanisms exist there. And a big part of managing SaaS platforms and third-party hosts is going to be contract language and vendor management. And I have a slide for that later. Continuous pen testing. This is kind of a new thing. It's not new. There are a couple of players in this space. But the concept is that I do a pen test every year. Cool. What about the other 11.9 months that I'm going to be sitting out there exposed if a new vulnerability or a new misconfiguration, is presented into my environment? I have this kind of, snapshot in time, which is really great. But like, what about all the other time? And that's kind of what this is designed to address. I will absolutely tell you out of the gate, the continuous automated pen tests are not as good as a human being, but they're better than nothing, right? They're better than a vulnerability scan. I'll tell you that right now. And so, yeah, Spencer's dropping some really good links in chat if you guys want to check that out. And I'll cover some additional ones at the end as well. But the point that I'm getting at with continuous pen testing is we are starting to see this as part of a normal cybersecurity program. It's just like vulnerability scanning, right? It's just like continuous pen testing is absolutely a part of that. Now, you're probably going to ask, and if you haven't, um, you know, what's the difference between, continuous vulnerability scanning and continuous pen testing? Well, the continuous pen testing utilizes kind of pushing past that initial like check for CVEs thing. Pen testing is designed to go beyond that. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get to a point where we're finding the new cross-site scripting flaw that WordPress has blessed us with because they love to do that. And so now I know that thing's out there. I might not find that with Nessus. I might not find that with Burp Enterprise, but I will find that if I'm running this through a continuous pen testing platform. So that's what we're trying to accomplish here. To literally no one's surprise, we're going to talk about AI and large language models, right? Everybody that is listening to me right now has used it, is familiar with it, and very likely works in an organization where it has been implemented. And if you don't think it has, you're wrong. What I mean is this is kind of the new shadow IT. If you guys remember that phraseology from a while back, I hate buzzwords, but they do the job. So what are you doing around that, right? And what I've noticed is a lot of people are in such a rush to get this because not having AI puts you behind the curve that they're forgetting that there need to be security controls in place for this thing, and then the testing needs to occur and validation needs to occur. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well. The other thing is assume breach. This is a form of internal and cloud-based penetration testing where you provide credentials to the pen tester and then they see how big the crater is, right? See how good your telemetry is, your monitoring, your detection inside your environment. This was born because identity is a new perimeter, right? We're saying, hey, I'm going to get an identity from you. I'm going to get one of your accounts. Then what happens? That's the question we're trying to answer here. And so the traditional model of internal network-based pen testing, where we ship you a VM or you crank up a Kali box or a laptop, yeah, hackers don't ship laptops, right? At least not any that I've ever seen. So why is that a model anymore? It's not, right? And I would even argue that, what used to be the perimeter, again, it's pushed out all over the world now, and we have to treat it as such. So that's what an assumed breach penetration test is all about: is answering the question, what happens when they get there. And so these are all, not all of these are like bleeding edge, right? But these are things you may or may not have already incorporated into your cybersecurity budget and plan. And I think you need to really seriously consider, biting off a couple of these in your 2026 budget. Much of this stuff you can solve on your own through research and resources that are already out there. All right, so John said, current problem I see at the moment is we live in a time of vendor FU pricing versus a finite budget. Sysadmin service most important be protected, basics important to cover. Work towards a priority list. So if I understand the question correctly, um, I would work backwards from the order of new basic technology in your environment. Let me explain. You bought XYZ, in the last 18 months. Are those things squared away? Right. So obviously the fundamentals, please always, and you address that, right? Like you have to cover the basics. Yeah, I get that. All right, so where do we go from there? Well, I'm going to look at what I'm utilizing, right? And so the AI, it's kind of funny that you posted that right. I was just talking about AI because that's a really good example of, hey, this is a new evolving thing that we are absolutely going to adopt, right? We can't not have this in our environment because our people will go crazy and we'll be behind our competitors. So yeah, man. So that's where I'm going to prioritize first, and I would also do it just based on the risk level. Me personally, AI is very risky, right? I'm putting that as like maybe a 9.0 on a 10 scale of threat to my organization if we get it wrong. Now, contrast that with, hey, we got a new WordPress site. Yeah, it's probably messed up, but is it going to be a fundamental, problem for your organization if something happens to that? Maybe, maybe not, right? AI, absolutely yes. So that's what I would be looking at, John, is I would work backwards from the last 24 months of acquisitions for new technology, new stacks, whatever that looks like for you guys. And then I would address each and every one of those in the order of risk that they create to your organization. I hope that helps. If not, I would like to understand more about where you're going with that question. So, all right. So this is more advanced form of things I think you should be considering. Some of these may not apply to you, right? If you're one of those fortunate few who host everything on-prem and you don't have any SaaS, cool, man. Don't worry about that, right? But I would highly encourage you guys to look into each one of these and see how they impact you and see what you can do about that. There are very specific things you can do about each one of these that are well documented and well known, and there are tons of resources out there on the internet. If you have questions about any of these, again, reach out to me. We'll jump on a phone call. I'll help you out. No big deal. All right. So what are we going to do about it? You wanted a priority list? Here we go, bro. Right here. In order of what I think is important, and this is a continuous process, folks. Do not misunderstand me. Don't go 1 to 5, call it a day and go home. It's 1 to 5, 1 to 5. It's a cycle, right? And so continuous testing. Again, the reason this is so important to me, folks, your cloud environment. How many of you guys have gone into Azure and it looked different than it did the day before? right? Everybody has. This stuff is evolving at a rate that we cannot possibly keep up with it. In fact, 90% of the time, something will change and we're not even told. It's not, it might be in a release note text file, 300 miles away or something we're never going to see. But there are constantly evolutions of this technology in these SaaS products, in these cloud products that you cannot possibly keep up with. The only way you're going to know is if you're continuously doing evaluations of your security footprint. Yeah. And to Spencer's point, there are no CVEs for cloud vulnerabilities, right? So there could be something out there you don't even know about. So how are you addressing that? How are you bridging the gap between pen tests, right? And obviously it's insane to do a pen test every month. Like, I mean, yeah, it'd be cool. You'd have a lot of good coverage, but it would be all you'd ever do. So that's an unrealistic expectation. So how can we bridge that gap? We bridge that through continuous testing, right? Continuous validation. Identity attack resilience. Again, I mentioned the assume breach penetration test. That is the most effective way and I'm not just saying that because I do pen tests, right? This is just, honest to God, the best way I know to do this is an assume breach pen test because it's going to tell you what kind of visibility you have into a compromised identity. Because if I can log into your environment, start moving around inside your cloud infrastructure or inside your Active Directory environment, you have no idea it's happening. You're going to be in for a real bad day when the bad guys get in, right? So, can you detect me when I'm in your environment doing the things I shouldn't be able to do? Also, obviously, purple teams are an absolutely brilliant way to do this because it's a hypothetical. We actually had not too long ago, I think, like a couple weeks ago, we had one of our partners reach out to us and they're like, "Hey, I want you to compromise a token and try to replay it so that we can see if we get alerts or we can see if our detection and logging mechanisms are working properly." That's what I'm talking about here. So, I mean, and again, you don't even need to hire anybody to do this, man. Go jump in a room with a bunch of technical folks and maybe a couple of managers and say, "All right, cool. What are we going to do if an SSO token gets popped?" Right? What does that look like for us? And if you get a bunch of blank stares, you got work to do, right? And of course, adversary emulation is kind of like a hybrid of both of those assume breach purple team approach, which is what I was talking about earlier when we had somebody reach out to us, like let's just generate some events that look like the thing that we're trying to determine our capability for and go from there. SaaS cloud, we got to be pen testing this stuff, folks. I already mentioned CIS benchmarks. There are multiple approaches that you can take to dealing with the cloud insecurity issue. Pen testing is just one of them. There are many, but most importantly, again, going back to fundamentals, are we tracking what we have? If you can't produce a bulleted list of your SaaS providers in 5 minutes, you might have a problem. So detection and validation, I've kind of beat this to death, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. Purple teams, tabletops, all of those are validating the things you think are working. I don't know how many times we go into an offensive security engagement and they're like, "Oh, we're good, man. We're good. We got ABC." And then at the end of it, they're like, "Oh, wow, that did not work how I thought it was going to work." Yeah, dude, because you're not validating it. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And then, of course, people process retesting validation. Don't underestimate the value of training your people to be experts in whatever the subject is you need them to be. If you need to send little Timmy off to cloud security school for a week and it costs you 10 grand because SANS is really expensive, um, is it worth it? I mean, I think so, right? Because now you have a resource and that resource is available to you. So don't discount the value of standing your people up and preparing them for success in whatever skill set it is that you need them to have. Okay, I get it, right? I'm a pen tester, so naturally my world kind of revolves around that. So take what I'm going to say from that perspective and understand that's why I'm looking at it in this way. But it can be the thing that you build your schedule around from a budgeting perspective. What do I mean by that? If you have absolutely no idea what your next initiative should be, and then you go get a pen test and it identifies all these issues, I don't want you to look at the finding like, "Oh no, I've got Suite 32 on my website. I need to patch that." That's not the point, guys. The point here is that you have a vulnerability from 2011 on a system that you're responsible for securing, or at least that you have some level of risk from, and you didn't know it, and it's 2025. To me, that's a whole different problem, and that's what I mean by taking the findings for what they mean, not what they are. Why am I in a position where I'm finding 5-year-old, 10, 11-year-old vulnerabilities on a system that's been in my ecosystem for years, right? That's the question I want to answer. That is going to drive budget more than, oh, I need to go patch this thing. And so if you take this process like I'm going to explain to you, this will drive and almost answer your budget for you on what you need to be working on. We prepare for the pen test, we execute the pen test, right? When I say prepare for it, I'm checking those fundamentals. How's my asset inventory look? Is it dated? If so, I'm not ready for a pen test, right? It's a test you study for it and that you prepare for. Patch your stuff. The last thing you need on a pen test report is a whole bunch of really silly things that could have been patched before we ever got here in the first place. So plan for it, prepare for it, and then time it in such a way that we execute the pen test, we do retesting, we do remediation, we identify the gaps that created the need for remediation and retesting, and then we build in solutions to that into our budget. So this cycle can absolutely feed what your next steps need to be if you know how to leverage it correctly. Um, Two examples. I already mentioned the Sweet 32, so I kind of jumped ahead a little bit there, right? And so if you do have that, and we see it all the time, literally every week, right? And so no hate, no shade, but like, why? Why am I still seeing this thing? Right? It's because we're probably not doing our vulnerability management. We're probably not handling asset management well. We need to improve on those things. So that's an easy one for us to say. Uh, yeah, I thought that was a good meme for this. But this is an easy way for us to say we have opportunities for improvement in our patch process, in our vulnerability management program. Well, what's a harder one? All right. So let's say you get Spencer, Tyler, they come in, they do an internal pen test. Now we're getting misconfigured certificate templates. Well, now I'm asking all kinds of questions. So first of all, do I have visibility? Do I have telemetry into that so that I can detect it when it happens? And two, how old is this? How long has it been there? What expertise do I need to get to make sure this doesn't happen again? Right. So now we're creating multiple workflows that are downstream from a single vulnerability that we found on a pen test, and we're creating work for ourselves. Not that everybody loves that, but we're creating work for ourselves that will lead to a more secure infrastructure in the future. So again, use these pen test reports. In fact, I think it was 2 episodes ago on the podcast, we talked about how to leverage this to secure funding. And so if you haven't seen or listened to that podcast, it's actually a pretty good episode. I think it's like 20 minutes or something like that. So it's nothing too crazy. All right, bonus material. And then I know we're coming up on time and I want to leave some opportunity for questions. What are we going to do about AI, folks? It's just an app. It's simple. This thing doesn't have to be any more complicated than it needs to be. Establish policies around its usage. Make sure you have control over the platform. Where's the data stored? We ask these questions anytime we procure a new application for our environment. Like, let's say we're spinning up a new web app for like loan origination for our bank or whatever. We're asking all of these fundamental questions. Where does the data live? Are we on our dedicated environment that nobody else has access to, et cetera? So we should be asking the same questions. AI is not net new except for one thing, and that is that there's a unique avenue of attack from the perspective of manipulating the language model. All right, that's where you bring offensive testing into play. And so there are actually already frameworks that exist for doing offensive testing. And what's cool about them, you don't even need a pen tester, dude. Literally go out there and go look at those frameworks, and they are broken out in ways where they're like, if you ask it in this way and then do this and you chain multiple poison requests together, then you might get this result, and if so, you have a security flaw. It's plain language. That's the beauty of it. I mean, you don't need a ton of skill to do this. So from a policy and a testing perspective, what I'm trying to tell you is you already have the tools to be successful in implementing AI. You do not have to make this harder than it needs to be. Now, can you hire somebody like us to do pen testing and AI? Yeah, of course. but there's a lot of stuff you can do without having to go down that road. All right. So last thing, vendor risk management. I still think this is part of our core functionality here, right? I didn't mention it in the blocking and tackling the basics, but I probably should have. Everyone seems to be struggling with this, and what I'll tell you is, it doesn't have to be complicated, right? When you guys are procuring new applications, let's say you want to get a new HR website, ask for a software bill of materials. Ask for their last pen test report. Put contract language in that so that there is teeth there if they have a security incident that involves your data. You have to protect yourself. And the only mechanism by which you can do that is with contracts and legal implications, because otherwise they're going to be in self-preservation mode, right? I'm talking specifically about like third-party applications and third-party hosted services. And so we have to protect ourselves. Do we need to monitor them? Yeah, man. We should absolutely should be. It's the reason that when we do pen tests, we don't just look at your on-prem stuff. We look at your SaaS services. We look at your cloud architecture. We look at all of that. And so what I'm telling you that for is, again, the mechanisms by which to be successful already exist. We just, for whatever reason, don't seem to be using them. So from a vendor risk management perspective, again, everything is third party now, right? We're not doing a lot of on-prem stuff anymore like we used to. So we have to put these things in place to protect ourselves. This is where you start hearing people talk about, supply chain attacks and third-party vendor attacks and all this. Yeah, of course, man. This is not new. We just haven't been following the basics and the fundamentals. So if this is a gap for you, I would put a little bit of money in your budget in 2026 to true this up. All right. 4 minutes left. This is just kind of the wrap up slide. I think this QR code probably doesn't take you anywhere malicious. Just kidding. It takes you to the podcast. So check us out over at offsec.blog. We put out a podcast episode every single week, have been for years. And so there's a lot of really good material there. Spencer posted a couple of the episodes that have talked about what we talk about, or they're covering topics that I've touched on today. And so those are down in chat. If you have any questions about anything that I've talked about today, maybe I didn't answer your question well in chat, or you just want to talk about, hey man, tell me more about this thing XYZ. My phone number is right there. My email address is right there. Reach out to me and let's get on the phone and talk about it. The vast majority of the things I talked about today are not even services that I sell. So that's not my angle here. I just want to be able to provide you guys with some insight into what we have the luxury of seeing on a day-to-day basis in the offensive security group. All right. Hit me with those questions, folks. Send it, Sarah. Can we unmute her, or does she have to? I'm not exactly sure how to operate this. I don't think I can.
I think she has to unmute. So let me see, because I allowed her to talk.
Okay.
There she goes.
Oh, I didn't mean to press the button. My bad.
Oh, no worries. No worries. We're going to put you on the spot. Awesome. So if anybody has questions, now's the time to ask them. I'll hang out for another 2 minutes and then I will hit the road. So I really appreciate you guys coming